This video is brought to you by Squarespace. More about them later in this video. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and we've got a special treat for all of you today. Today's script was provided by Quentin Burns, and it is not only extremely well written, but it offers us a look into the history of Death Valley, quite unlike anything you've heard before. It's a trip through deep time, through myth, and offers a haunting vision of the future. Be sure to give Quentin Burns a shout out in the comments. Tell us what your favorite Death Valley fact is, and let us begin. Death Valley National Park, the sign says. Below that, in smaller letters, homeland of the Timbisha Shoshone. Death Valley National Park in the American Southwest is a monument to the sublime, aching beauty of the desert. It is home to the Timbisha Shoshone tribe, a branch of the Western Shoshone Nation, and also to the Pahrump Paiute tribe of the Southern Paiute Nation, and to the desert Kawayasu. It is home to the red ochre and red ironstone and records of the past. It is home to abandoned mines and empty kilns, trapped in the fading glow of the American frontier. It is home to the swirling tangle of memory and mythology, American and Shoshone and Paiute and Kawayasu. 700 million years ago, it was a last bastion of life on Earth. The trail from that time to this one is winding and may be obstructed by a familiar gate. When you enter Furnace Creek Pass in the shadow of the Black Mountains, you might become a 49er. Bewildered by the heat and the alien expanse before you, the desert fear sets in. The Lost 49ers took 4 months to cross this valley on their hapless way to join the California Gold Rush. In the second month, they burnt their wagons and ate the oxen. In the third month, one of them died. Reassure yourself that you will fare better. These days, there is a sign to tell you where you are and a road to show you where to go. The road splits the desert, disappearing into the glimmer of a mirage, and it will take you past strange wonders. Here are mountains brushed in pixie dust, shimmering green and pink, 200 miles of salt flats, shining white and spiderwebbed with fissures. Miniature cities of salt crystals bloom and burst in the heat. Hot wind pours over the sand dunes, eroding boulders into alien mushrooms. The valley is a painting of magnificent desolation, beautiful and terrible. There is nothing familiar here. You do not belong here and must soon leave. Before you can cross the mountains and exit the boundary of the wild, you look back to see where you have come from. Behind you, the valley is full of ghosts. Ghosts of the frontier, miners and manifest dreamers. Ghosts of the people who lived here before the frontier. The ghosts of the ancient lake crying for water these 10,000 years. Ghosts of the future are there too. Every year the valley gets hotter. You can almost feel the thin continental crust under the valley, the ring of volcanoes in the mountains, the fire reaching up from below. Apocalyptic imagery is all around you these days, and California is always on fire somewhere. You might look back at this place you have come through like the 49ers did and name it Death Valley, but you would be wrong. Death Valley was what the Lost 49ers called it. To Timbisha Shoshone activist and history expert Pauline Estevez, it was Timbisha. The word Timbisha refers to the red material found in the Black Mountains, she explained in a draft report to the American Congress. Our ancestors, the old ones, used this material called ochre in English. They would use it like paint on their faces to protect them and heal them. The old ones believed that this material, Timbisha, strengthened their spirituality. Our people, the Timbisha, are named after this material, and so is our valley. Ghosts can tell the story of Death Valley. Earth and water, the ingredients of ochre, tell the much longer story of Timbisha. Red ochre is red from hematite and iron oxide. Volcanic deposits have painted a full rainbow of iron oxides over the Black Mountains, the eastern border of the salt flats. The basement rocks of the valley are red from iron too, colored long before the volcanoes and the mountains. They formed underwater 700 million years ago. Oxygen destroys most of the iron that accumulates in water. These basement rocks could only have formed beneath oxygen-depleted waters. They suggest Timbisha was an ice-sealed ocean, a closed environment. Diamectite rocks are mosaics of glacial debris. They form when smaller rocks ride along with glaciers, eventually falling into the ocean and joining the seabed. Dropstones are the larger version, boulders that sink heavily into the mud, deforming layers of sediment around them. As a layer of sediment settles, magnetic particles move around. They align themselves with the Earth's magnetic field before eventually getting locked in place. In this way, rocks can record the latitude where they formed. The rocks have told us that while Timbisha was under ice, it was near the equator. 700 million years ago, there was ice near the equator. If it was there, it was probably everywhere. The rock record at Death Valley contains some of our best evidence for this phenomenon, called Snowball Earth, when the planet became almost completely ice-locked. It was a 50 million year long winter. The seafloor's algae carpet died, starved of oxygen by the ice sheets. Rocks from the time of Snowball Earth are low in carbon-12, a signpost for algae. It could have been over for life on Earth. At the shores, however, the composition of the ironstone is different. At places like Timbisha, where the frozen land met the frozen sea, the water had some oxygen. Modern glaciers show us how air bubbles trapped in the ice become part of the meltwater, introducing oxygen where the base of the glacier flows into the ocean. Under the ice, in the frozen desert, life crept on. Above the ice, volcanoes built up CO2 in the atmosphere, eventually generating enough greenhouse heat to overcome the cooling. Once the thaw was rolling, it happened fast. Many of the red rocks from Snowball Earth are overlaid with light gray capstones, like the Noonday Dolomite Formation in Timbisha. Dolomite is made in warm, shallow waters, heavy with calcium and magnesium carbonates. The equator was warm again, not long after it had frozen. 635 million years ago, in the wake of the Great Thaw, the first soft-bodied creatures appeared in the seas and diversified rapidly. Life poured out of the barren land, having been there all along. If you don't want your brand to be as deserted as Death Valley, then you're going to need a fancy website to get your message out. And today's sponsor, Squarespace, is just what you're looking for. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform perfect for entrepreneurs. Whether you're an entrepreneur attempting to sell lemonade to Death Valley tourists, I hear it's a popular spot for coyotes, or anything else, Squarespace has all the tools you need to get the job done, all in one place and on your terms. With Squarespace's next-generation website engine, the Fluid Engine, you'll be able to choose from a template and customize it to your heart's content. And unlike using an expensive web designer, your website will be fully functional on desktop and mobile from the get-go. With Squarespace's guided design system, Squarespace Blueprint, and their brand spanking new AI and SEO tools, you'll be able to pick from a curated list of layout and styling options to ensure you're able to build your brand the way you want from the ground up. And make sure your website hits all those SEO sweet spots, ensuring you reach the right people to grow your audience, rather than leaving them out in the desert. And best of all, if you're looking to sell your wares on your website, Squarespace offers flexible payment options with simple but powerful tools. Accept credit cards, PayPal, and Apple Pay. And in eligible countries, your customers will have the option to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. Ready to get started? Check out squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now, back to the video. The ingredients for photosynthetic life are earth, water, and light. Timbisha's balance of available ingredients has changed drastically over the course of its history, but the ingredients were always there. In the Cambrian, when the soft-bodied creatures were working to evolve hard parts, the region was a shallow sea. 200 million years ago, the tectonic plate holding the Pacific Ocean began sliding under the edge of the plate holding North America, and the seafloor rose up to become the land. That process, called subduction, is still happening. 25 million years ago, it created a lattice of fault lines across Southern California. Blocks of crust tilted and slid along the lattice, forming mountains and valleys. The land was pulled apart, stretched thin. The valley became lakes until the lakes became valleys again, on and off for millennia. Timbisha's final lake disappeared around 10,000 years ago. The first humans knew a shifting valley. Sometimes there were lakes, sometimes wetlands. Water travels underground roads, now coming up in springs and seeps. When it rains, an ephemeral lake reappears. Plants have strategies to find or wait for water. The lilies that grow over the sand dunes shed their stems when it's dry, hibernating as bulbs. The creosote bushes that cover the basin floor are drought-enduring. Their deep, efficient root systems and small, waxy leaves optimize water retention. Honey mesquite and desert willow can avoid drought altogether, with roots long enough to reach permanent groundwater. The one strategy common to all plants and animals in Timbisha is to roam. Timbisha is a migratory world. For long stretches, the valley was wetter or drier, hotter or colder. In response, occupants changed where and how they spent their time. Plant populations move over generations. When their seeds take root in more favorable areas. In drier times, they travel up to slopes into the mountains. When the environment was wetter, they went back down. Herbivores followed the plants and carnivores followed the herbivores. Humans followed everything. We can tell when a plant species entered the valley and how it moved around there by looking for pack rat middens. When Pauline Estevez was a child, her elders showed her the trick of middens. Under a top layer of rocks and twigs, crusted together with dried urine, is the pack rat's collection of ephemera and plant matter. As Pauline dug down through the collection, she was told to smell the mesquite pods. When they didn't smell foul anymore, she ate one, and it was fresh. Pack rats use the topsoil layers as a decoy, keeping their food on the bottom. Their crystallized urine preserves the midden and can be radiocarbon dated. 10,000-year-old middens have been found in Timbisha. Pack rats have a forage radius of 300 feet, so their food stores tell us what was growing within 300 feet of the midden. Using pack rat data, we can see what resources would have been available to people in the valley over time. A database compiled from 20th century interviews shows that prior to colonization, people in the valley were using and managing around 150 plants. 75 of those were a food source. Indigenous people cleaned and pruned the mesquite groves and burned shrubby areas to improve growth of seed plants. They dug up wild onions, hyacinth bulbs, and edible roots. They roasted agave for 24 hours and pounded the sweet mass into cakes. They ate cactus fruits, acorns from the spring mountains, and fresh and boiled greens. Pinyon pine entered the valley around 11,500 years ago, unaware of its future role. At first, only the mature brown pine cones were gathered. Between 8,000 and 5,000 years ago, the valley experienced wild climate fluctuations. Sometimes it was hotter and drier than any time since. Large game animals left the valley and the pines moved up the slopes. Humans left the valley for 2,000 years after it became impossible to live there, or so speculated anthropologists when they had yet to find evidence. Now we know people didn't leave. Instead, they changed what they ate and where they went, moving upslope with the pines or roving farther for sustenance. Seeds replaced game as the primary food source. At earlier sites in the region, archaeologists found an average of 4 grinding stones. By the time of peak high temperatures, the average was 124. The more difficult work of gathering and extracting immature seeds from green pinyon pine cones had begun. 1,350 years ago, the medieval warming period launched another huge leap in pinyon seed processing. By Pauline's time, the late summer pinyon harvest was a focal event in the yearly cycle of life. Harvesters used willow tools to gather the pinyon cones into conical willow baskets for roasting. Willow shoots were the ubiquitous material for baskets and water jugs, which could be waterproofed with pinyon pine pitch. Cattails were used to make mats, shelters, boats, and shingles. Yucca fibers made sandals, and the pith made soap. Creosote sap was a glue and sealant. 60 species of plant were in use as medicine. Ground poppy seeds made burn salves, and sagebrush made antiseptics. Boiled wormwood made poultices for swelling and rheumatism, and teas for childbirth and venereal disease. Milkweed sap removed warts and dressed sores. Traditionally, when using a plant for medicine, the Timbisha first explain their problem to the plant and ask it for a cure. The people of the valley maintained a huge knowledge base of desert plants. A Pahrump Paiute described the cycle of land management this way to an ethnographer. Plants must be collected from particular areas or at particular times of the season. A system of traditional beliefs and methods attend the collection and use of plants. Traditions that involve elements of respect, approach, preparation, dosage, administration, and of consumption of foods and medicines. We know plants are found in certain areas for reasons explained in our traditional stories and beliefs. When white miners and ranchers moved into the valley, they cut down pinyon forests for charcoal. They occupied water sources, where their livestock wrought havoc on native plants. The Timbisha's time-honored cycle of migratory hunting and harvesting became impossible. People needed jobs to survive, and jobs were thin on the ground. White prospectors chased ghosts and legends through the hills, looking for gold and finding little. The mines were rarely prosperous. The only big company in the area, Harmony Borax Works, folded after 5 years. Indigenous people became laborers, building the roads and railway. Once there was no more borax to ship, a new purpose had to be imagined for the train: tourism. Pauline Estevez's father was the stonemason for a resort hotel at Furnace Creek, a place the Timbisha would shortly be expelled from. In 1933, the Death Valley National Monument was created, care of the National Park Service. The mandate of the NPS was to preserve the national environment, unimpaired, for the enjoyment of future generations. From their point of view, the Timbisha were an impairment. They were hunting on a national monument. Their horses were damaging vegetation. They were not part of the natural environment, and their living conditions were unsightly to tourists. Pauline Estevez, age 9, thought the army had pulled in. They were all in uniform, she said. We were told to be wary of them, not to speak back to them. Over the next half-century, the National Park Service terrorized the Timbisha Shoshone. They banned all hunting, most food gathering, and travel to seasonal camps. They blocked access to springs. They destroyed homes and forced evictions. The first domino had been toppled 400 years earlier when a distant pope issued a foul edict. The 1452 Doctrine of Discovery, promoting the destruction and exploitation of non-Christians, became the spirit of the age. In 1823, the U.S. Supreme Court codified the doctrine. It said that once discovered, native peoples lost their rights to complete sovereignty and independent nations. The treatment of the Timbisha by the American government was no shock. But why did the National Park Service in particular become the hammer? Nature is what is outside the city. More than that, it is the foil to the city, the opposite thing. It is someplace over there, apart from us. To the Europeans who colonized America, untamed nature was a threat. In their creation story, the first humans were exiled from a bountiful garden of life into the bleak, inhospitable wilderness. Wild lands held a moral danger as well as a physical one. By the end of the 19th century, wilderness had changed. Environmental historian William Cronin attributes the change to two cultural constructs: the sublime and the frontier. Sublime was a core concept in Romanticism. It described something impossibly huge and overwhelmingly powerful. Sublime landscapes were places where you might confront God, places of terrible awe imbued with supernatural significance, places like Death Valley. At first, this sublime wilderness wasn't so different from the wasteland. It was still brutal and dangerous, still Christian. But the script was turning. Now Eden could be cast as the original lost wilderness, and human civilization was the dark place outside the gate. As wilderness became more and more of a natural pastime in America, the sublime lost its teeth. When the first national park opened in 1872, the wilderness was a comfortable place of temporary escape. The second ingredient for modern American wilderness was frontier nostalgia. The frontier was a kind of American myth. To follow the myth, to follow the trails west, to walk in the footsteps of cowboys and outlaws was a way of becoming American. To cross the desert and colonize the wild lands was to participate in the creation of a country and the recreation of the self. On the frontier, you could become someone new. By its nature, the frontier was always going to disappear. Eventually, there is nothing left to colonize, and so even while the frontier existed, Americans were nostalgic for it. They wanted to keep the myth alive. To preserve the feeling of the frontier, to protect frontier nostalgia and mythology for future generations, you need to preserve the wilderness. American wilderness preservation efforts kicked into gear at the tail end of the Wild West era, when nothing seemed very wild anymore. A few monuments had to be kept, monuments to wilderness, to the frontier, and to the creation myth of America. When you are writing the eulogies for an empty, untouched, uncorrupted wild, you won't want to look at the people who live there and are still living there. When you go looking online for Timbisha folklore, one story dominates the search results. It goes like this. Long ago, Death Valley was a green and prosperous place. The queen of the valley wanted a magnificent palace for herself, but the work was never done fast enough and the palace was never magnificent enough. In the endless pursuit of her greed, she enslaved her own people. One day, she whipped her daughter to death. As her daughter died, the land withered and became a desert to punish her. This story doesn't appear in any anthropological collection of Shoshone mythology, and it sounds nothing like stories that do. The Timbisha never had royalty and did not view their homeland as a punishment. The withered desert and absence of prosperity is what the lost 49ers saw, not what the Timbisha knew. Why does this fake myth exist? One answer. It is not a Timbisha myth, but an American one. Americans are the greedy queen destroying their own land through exploitation, enslaving their own family. The story is a warning. It says that if society persists like this, we will strip our planet bare. If that is the case, why does this American myth wear Timbisha clone it? In the story, the Timbisha are made culpable for destroying their own traditional way of life. It wasn't the settlers and the American government, it was the evil queen. When Americans got there, the land had already fallen. Humans had already been cast out of the garden to wander the wastelands. That old, inevitable story. Making the story of indigenous destruction inevitable reinforces the frontier myth. If it already happened and the land was already barren, then the settlers arrived in an empty land. The Timbisha lost it long ago by themselves. Any remaining Timbisha were a fluke, a cautionary tale. The fake myth is taking you down a trail. It leads to assumptions and towards the worldview that created it. It leads to a long road through the desert where Americans are still following their American myths. Some of the roads through Death Valley are old Timbisha trails undercover. They are trails between the present and the past. The desert is a network of trails, a web of connections. There are animal trails and human trails, routes for trade and visiting. Smoke trails rise into the sky and water carves secret trails deep under the rock. In the sand dunes, mesquite roots delve 200 feet down to find it. Trails are sacred in Shoshone and Paiute cultures because they direct the flow of life across space and time. Trails can be traveled physically or they can be traveled mentally through dream and song. Song trails are ceremonial songs about journeys through real places. A song trail might take you along trading routes through ancient villages or between sacred sites. One song that visits the Death Valley region is the Southern Paiute Fox Trail. In the song, Fox travels from spring to spring on his way to visit Blue Jay, encountering other animals on the way. By performing the song, the singer visits and thanks each spring. Like the plants, animals, and people of the land, the stories tend to roam. In 1935, ethnographer Julian H. Stewart collected Shoshone myths around the region. He recorded several versions of each story, every one different. Commenting on his work, Pauline Estevez suggested that the interviewed storytellers may have avoided sharing taboo details, leading to some of the discrepancies. Stewart was told a story about a race of Kozo hot springs west of the Panamint Mountains and the national park. Like the fake Desert Queen story, it recounts a time when Timbisha's inhabitants negatively impacted their own environment. It is from the time when animals were people, and even the sun was a person. In the story, the people bet their lives on a race. At the end of the race, the losers were to be cooked on a fire. When Sun lost, the people wanted to spare him, but Coyote insisted. Sun was put on the fire, and everything went dark. While Coyote was cooking the Sun, everyone else ran for the house. Once it was dark, Coyote couldn't find the house. He stumbled around the valley and mountains all winter, searching with his hands until he recognized Mount Whitney, the highest point in the land. There, he found a trail he used to follow and crawled his way back to the house. In the house, everyone shouted at Coyote, and a little light appeared. Coyote noticed this and said, "The sun will come out when I shout." He shouted, and it went completely dark again. Duck quacked 3 times and the sun came back. Then the people emerged from the house into the springtime. The Desert Queen story had a linear narrative with a clear message. The story of the race is circular. Coyote wanders the valley and makes it home to his starting point. The people live at Kozo Hot Springs and end their race there. The sun lights the world, goes away for winter, and then comes back. The full story focuses on Coyote's actions and experiences along his journey. In both content and form, the 2 stories represent profoundly different ways of seeing the same place. The fake story's purpose was to take you on a trail. That is also the purpose of the real story and of all stories. Beginning in the 1960s, Pauline Estevez traveled the world telling Timbisha's story. She was an activist for the Western Shoshone National Council, speaking in solidarity with other oppressed peoples. They lived out of a suitcase, eating what they could and what they were given. They met scientists, authors, and protesters singing John Lennon. During a campaign against nuclear testing on tribal land, Pauline met 6 of the first responders at Chernobyl and corresponded with them until they died. In 1983, after decades of work by Pauline and other activists, the Timbisha Shoshone were recognized as a sovereign tribe, which is not true sovereignty as their actions still require approval from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It took another 17 years of public campaigning, lobbying Congress, and organizing legal action before portions of their land were returned. Of the 7,754 acres returned, 314 were inside the national park. That set a critical precedent. It was the first and only time a national park has returned lands within its boundaries. When the National Park Service set out to preserve the wilderness, it preserved the American concept of wilderness and everything baked into that concept. The sublime, the frontier, and the beautiful emptiness. The intrinsic, necessary separation between humans and environments. There is a view common to the Lost 49ers and the National Park Service, common to frontier prospectors and romantic poets. It says that whether the wild lands are good or bad, they are other. Whether wilderness is the Garden of Eden or the Valley of Death, it is on the side of a gate. Before history could begin in this view, humans had to cross the gate. To be human is to be on one side of the gate. The gate is a threat to real environmentalism. It says that either we are exploiters or we are preservers. It says that the ultimate preservation must be to remove humans from the land entirely. That leaves us nowhere to go. It leads to the end of the road, the vision of apocalypse. With no frontier left, nowhere to follow the call of manifest destiny, we are trapped. Every year, the desert gets hotter. In 2023, America saw more heat deaths than in any previous year on record. 3 of them happened in Death Valley National Park. A spokesperson for the park warned that if climate change stays on its trajectory, the way Death Valley is now might be the way surrounding areas of the desert could become. Death Valley won't be a sublime elsewhere. It will be your backyard in Las Vegas. It will be part of the everyday cycle of life, just as it always has been. 700 million years ago, the Earth was frozen. Life moved slowly, the sluggish wisps of a fading dream. But in Timbisha, life was flowing. Oxygen flowed from the air down the glacier's road into the water. Life stayed, changed, and endured. 7,000 years ago, Timbisha was hotter than any time before or since. For 2,000 years, it was considered uninhabitable, but it wasn't. Life adapted, finding new paths to travel. The only way to adapt is by understanding the real landscape, not the ghost town mirage. If distorted histories and false fables have been put before us, we cannot see the land unless we brush aside their ghosts and look at the real thing. Look at the record of the land, etched into the rock by wind and water, hidden in pack rat middens. Listen to the real stories and voices of the people who live there, entwined for centuries with the desert trails. Refute the cultural destruction of the frontier. Thanks to the efforts of Pauline Estevez and many others, the Timbisha language is still spoken and their culture is still taught. Only by knowing a place for itself can we come to truly live in it. To live, not to exploit or preserve. Stories and histories are trails to knowledge, and Timbisha is a web of trails stretching back into the past and ahead into the future. It may happen, if you follow them, that you become part of the web. I hope you learned something new today, and if you did, if you enjoyed this content, be sure to drop a like for the algorithm, comment your thoughts, and share this video with someone who loves learning about new places and the rich history often lying in wait for you to discover. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.